Hey guys, welcome to Lesson 3 of Linux Terminal 101. In this lesson, we'll be going over Linux file permissions and file ownership. Now, for people that are coming from Windows-based environments, I do want to mention something. Keep in mind, Linux is a little bit different. Everything in Linux is a file. Hardware devices, your keyboard, your sound card, those are also expressed as files. Even a directory is just simply a type of file. So I know that's a bit different than maybe you're used to, but just keep in mind as we move forward here. Now, ownership and permissions. Every file has 3 user-based permission groups. The individual that actually owns the file, that user, a grouping for their permissions. The group the owner is a member of, the permissions for that group, and everybody else on the system. Now, permissions are assigned to each permission group individually, and the permissions are, what you would expect: read, write, and execute. If you have read privileges for that particular file, you can view its contents. You can, see it exists. Now, if you'd have write privileges, you could modify the file. You could make changes to its content. You could even, let's say, delete the file. Now, we have a little bit of a difference between a regular file and a directory as far as execute goes. To be able to navigate into the directory, you'd have to have execute privileges on that particular directory. But with a regular file, it more pertains to, what you would consider as executable, a bash script, a binary, a program, simply put. So a slight difference there just between regular files and directories, I just wanted to point out. But let's move into a graphic example here. Our 3 different permission groupings are displayed. Now, each one of them, like I said before, will have its own set of permissions. And those permissions will be applied to one file. So 3 sets of permissions, 3 types of permissions within that grouping, all pertaining to the same file. Now, a command that we did use in Lesson 1, ls, is going to be used here, but it's going to be used with the L option. Sometimes this is referred to as list long or long list. I've heard it both ways. And that command is simply going to output the permissions for all the files within its scope. Now, each one of the files within that command scope, the permissions for that file are going to be expressed using 10 characters. Now, just to make things more clear, we can divide those 10 characters into 4 individual sections. The type of object, the owner's permissions, the group's permissions, and all users' permissions. Now, I know I said 10 characters, and you're probably wondering how that divides out. The first section uses only 1 of those characters. Then each of the following sections use 3 apiece. So 3, 3, 3, 9, plus the 1 gives us our 10 characters. Now, I'd like to move into another graphic here. Here I have the 10 characters represented as dashes. Typically, when you're talking permissions, if you see a dash, that means that particular spot, that location, will not have that particular permission. And that'll be a little easier to understand if we overlay this. Now, if we look between of course we have our first, which indicates the type. But let's look at the other 3 groupings here. The owner, the group, and then the section here at the end for everybody else, or other. Now let's just compare the owner and the group sections. Notice you have RWX for the owner's group. That means, of course, they would have read, write, and execute permissions. But in the group section, notice how the W is missing. We have a dash instead. Here, that particular permission, the write permission, the modify permission, better way to say it, is excluded. The owner's group would not have modify rights for this file. And then last, everyone else on the system would only be able to see A, that the file exists, and B, view its contents. So, little quick way to reference it. Now let's break down this first section, the type of files. In Linux there is quite a few different types. Now you're not going to see all these with the same regularity. You will see regular file, directory, and symbolic link, the first two and the last one on the list, by far the most. In fact, you can very likely see all three of these right within your home directory. To see some of the others, like a block device, you'd actually have to move outside of your home directory and poke around in the file system to find something of that type. But moving back to our example, let's work through this. We can tell by the first character representing the type that, if we go back to our list, we can see a dash represents a regular file. So this is a regular file. The next section, the dark green section, the owner section, we can see they have read, write, and execute. The following, again, we have read and execute only, no modify permissions. And last, the other group, or all users, we only have read permissions. And this is exactly what it's going to look like whenever you're inside of a terminal and you're using that list long or that ls with the L option, that command. This is the output. And it's going to look, it won't be as nicely color coded. It'll look something a little bit more like this. This is another graphic. It has a little bit more information. Kind of breaks down everything we've discussed all into one little page, one little image. Here you can see we have our type, and over here they're only showing us two different file types. We know there's more. And then they have the permission groupings also divided up here. And then they go one step further than our first graphic by saying that the R represents read, the W represents writes, and the X represents executes. Though I'm fairly certain that's reasonably easy to figure out. Probably the order or which characters apply to which group is probably the more difficult portion. So without further ado here, let's move to the terminal and go through a couple examples. What could be better? So inside this little directory, and one thing I wanted to show you was that alias that I mentioned. If you are on a Ubuntu-based system, there's a shortcut command, an alias, called LL. And that's going to be the equivalent of ls with the A and the L option. So for our example, and let me just show you the difference between that. So if we were just to do ls with the long listing, you would only see regular files, directories. You're not going to see anything that's hidden. If you were to use LL, notice that I have this little, here we go, hidden file right here. We don't see that up in here. It's missing. So, a little bit of a difference between the two. I didn't want to misinform anyone. But going back to our LL, the first column is going to be the 10 characters we've been discussing. The first column is going to indicate the permissions of the file. And also that first character, the type. So we have two directories here. Not that they're necessarily real directories. You'll see this at the top of every directory. One meaning current directory, the second meaning previous directory. But regardless, we can still look at this and the permissions here for it. So we're saying it's a directory. We're saying the owner has read, write, and execute privileges. we're saying the owner's group has read and execute, and we're saying everyone else on the system also has read and execute. Now that's a little bit different if we get on here a little further. Let's get onto our first regular file here, this 24 punchdown. We can see by the dash it's a regular file. We can see quickly by the first 3 characters the owner has read and write but cannot execute. Same with the grouping, read, write, no executes. And last, everyone else on the system would only be able to see this file exists and view its contents. Now, moving down to our script here, another little thing that some terminals will have, if it's an executable and it has executable rights, which this does, you're going to have a star after it. Now, what that basically means is you could run that particular script just by referencing the name. Simple enough. Now, we're not going to be going over how to modify permissions in this particular lesson. You know, I'll just save that for the next, so just forget about that for right now. And to briefly go over what these other columns are describing, when you do a list long, you have your permissions column, your first column. Your next is going to tell you how many links there are to that particular file. The next column is going to tell you the owner. Column following that is going to tell you the owner's group. After that, you have the size. And the last column before the name is going to tell you the modified date. Now, I don't have any, yeah, I do. I do have one that was created last year. So this guy right here. Now, notice if it was created in the current year, you have month, day, and time. If it was created in a different year, you just have month, day, and year. So, a little tidbit, not that important, but something I did want to point out while we were here. In our next lesson, we'll be reviewing a little more with permissions, how to change from using letters to using a more numeric-based way to assign, and actually the commands on how to assign the permissions, how to modify them, and even to modify the owner of the file. So thank you for joining us in this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.